Aloha. Welcome to Lease Seminars sessions. This session, we're going to talk about what's in a lease, the legal document that dictates what the conditions are for a person renting the property from the landlord. And so I'm going to talk about the different components of a lease. And you'd be surprised, some of these rules are kind of weird or different. Example, did you know that in a lease, you don't have to have a date? You go, what? Well, that's what the law says. A date is not absolutely essential to be a valid contract, but you should have one, right? Because you need to know when you start, when you end, but a date is not essential. That's what it says. But it's important because you need to know when do you start, when do you end, right? Second is there has to be contractual ability of the parties in the lease. So if the landlord is a corporation, they live forever. But if it's an individual, then that person has to have what they call contractual ability. Same with the lessee who's going to be renting the property, all right? So it says the parties that are named and the position has to be clearly indicated, and they have to have full contractual ability, which means that they're mentally competent, that they're 18 or older, and they're not under influence of drugs or coercion or force, that they're doing it of their own free will and choice. And usually that means that they're also mentally competent. So if you're under 18 in Hawaii, you're not mentally competent because you're not deemed to be an adult. So someone that's a child under 18 cannot sign a legally binding contract. Now they can sign the contract, but it's not binding to a minor. It is binding on the owner that is a corporation or an adult, 18 or older. Third, you have to have what they call mutual agreement with consideration. And consideration has to be how much is the security deposit. Usually it's 1 month or 2 months rent amount. And also it's how much is the monthly rent, all right? Now on residential properties, you can only take 1 month's security deposit. You cannot take more. But in commercial, you can take as many months of security deposit as you want, as you agree to. But the residential landlord-tenant code says the landlord can only take 1 month's security deposit. And also, he can only take 1 month's security deposit if they have a pet. Now, a pet is just an animal, but if you have a service animal or a comfort animal, then you cannot charge a security deposit for the pet. All right, so that's kind of interesting. So the parties have to reach a mutual agreement, and there has to be valid consideration, and that's the rent money. Then there has to be a description of the property. So in a commercial property, you might say 1050 Ala Moana Boulevard, Suite 415. And they'll also usually say how many square feet is that unit, and then how much is the rent per square foot, and then how much is what they call the common area maintenance, called the CAM. If it's residential, then they'll say 1150 Ala Moana Boulevard, apartment number 410. So the description of the property, you don't have to what they call a legal description, which we'll cover in a future video, but it should be enough to identify where are you in this property, which suite number, what floor, how many square feet. So now on an office space, you're going to have square feet. But in a residential, they'll usually just say 3-bedroom, 2-bath. But they won't say how many square feet that apartment is. But they will in a commercial real estate because they charge by the square foot on commercial properties. And so they usually use an address or maybe a tax map key for the description of the property, but not a legal description. They also have a clause in the contract that says the use of the premises must be legal, that you cannot do something illegal or dangerous, all right? Example would be, the landlord will say, what are you going to do with this office space you got? If you say, I'm going to have some chemicals in here, and I'm going to have Bunsen burners, and I'm going to experiment with chemicals and potential fire-producing agents, landlord will say, nope, no good, because they don't want fire. Or what somebody says, well, I'm going to sell, a little bit of drugs here and maybe do some gambling. That's not allowed. So it has to be for legal purposes. Now, in a commercial property, you have to make sure that the landlord looks at what are the different types of businesses that will be in this shopping center, and we want to have a good mix. We don't want all Japanese food or Chinese food. We don't want all products from, say, Mexico. So they want variety of different products and services that would draw more people in, because now the customer base would be widened considerably. There are specific things that the landlord is looking for, especially in a shopping center. They want a nice mix so they can have more and more people come to their stores. Next one is called legal purpose. And as I mentioned to you, it has to be legal. So I had an agent come to me one day and said, hey, my client has a little store in the front, but in the back, they have a gambling hall. And they make plenty of money on the gambling hall. So in my MLS instructions, can I say gambling hall included with the equipment? And I said, no, that's illegal. Okay? So I told him, you cannot sell a store with illegal gambling activity or drugs or whatever it happens to be. So it has to be a legal purpose. And 7 is who signs the documents. So let's say you're the tenant and you want to lease that property and you don't have much experience. And the landlord says, you haven't had much experience and we're not sure that we want to have you in our shopping center because we don't know if you're going to last. And I had that case happen with one of my friends. He and his partner were high school classmates, and they had a store in Hawaii Kai, a restaurant, and they wanted to have one in town. So the landlord for the town store said, you guys don't have much experience, so we need somebody else that's financially capable to personally guarantee the lease. And he and his friend had their parents co-sign the guarantee. The business didn't go well, and so these two young men went to the landlord and said, hey, look, we're not doing well. Can we get out of our lease? And the landlord said, your parents co-signed, guaranteed the lease. You can get out, but you have to pay $150,000 termination fee. They were floored, but they couldn't get out of it because the parents co-signed. So he calls me up because we're friends. And he says, what do I do? I said, why did you sign your parents to this co-signing? He said, well, that's the only way we could get in. So my advice to people is if you can't get in on your own, do not have your parents co-sign for you unless they're rich enough that they can afford to take that hit. And unfortunately, they did. So be careful about who signs and who guarantees those leases. Now, if you're going to record the document and have a lease for 5 years or longer, then they need to have the document notarized and recorded at the Bureau of Conveyance. If it's less than 5 years, my understanding is that you don't have to have it notarized and you don't have to have it recorded. So those are your 9 elements of a lease. Now, who drafts these leases? Usually, if it's a simple, small mom and pop operator, they may have what they call a boilerplate standard template. But if it's a whole floor, like $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 of lease rent, then usually the corporation attorney will draft up the document, the lease, and then they're going to negotiate back and forth. So the more complicated, the bigger the lease, then you're going to have more people involved from a legal side. But if it's a simple, store, 500,000 square feet, usually a template will work. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what's involved in this legal document called the lease. Aloha.